You wrote your book, Simon, before the betting scandal.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about how you came to write it, because it seems to me it's a kind of like a manual to this election campaign, really.
Well, after I wrote Chums, the publisher said, we want you to do a follow-up on British political corruption. The word for which in Britain has always been sleaze, but I regard that as a kind of euphemism.
Yeah.
Let's call corruption what it is. Corruption is that you use your public office as a politician or civil servant to enrich yourself. Obviously, corruption is always a problem in any political system. It seems to have got a lot worse, I would say, since about the turn of the century here. So I wrote this book to try and understand why did it get worse. And one reason I think is follow the money. You know, we now have an American political culture without really understanding it of dark money, political donations driving our politics. Americans understand that's the way their politics works. British people don't. And the other is what I call the death of the good chap, who I think really existed, who was this figure from the post-war era who had come out of the wars believing that the highest thing you could do was serve your nation. I mean, it sounds corny to us of our generation, but those people really believed it. Someone like Macmillan, who'd fought in World War One.
I mean, one of the things that I learned from you, many things I learned from you, was that there's actually a sort of classic text where the good chaps theory is outlined, which is this guy, Clive Priestley, who was former head of Thatcher's efficiency.
He was a civil servant.
Right. And you tell the story. He spelled it out, doesn't he?
Well, Priestley, this is 40 years ago.
Yeah.
He's talking to visiting Reagan administration officials about how the UK works, how the civil service works. And Priestley says, well, we have this good chaps theory. You know, these good chaps come out of university and you put them in the civil service. And because they're good chaps, you don't really want to tell them what to do. They'll do their own thing and you're just grateful that they're there. And Priestley was trying to say that's why your civil service is not particularly efficient or kind of value for money oriented. But in fact, Peter Hennessy, the academic who was listening in the audience, realised that's not just how the civil service works. That's how the whole of the British state is meant to work.
Yeah.
You have good chaps, you know, who went to public school, went to Oxbridge, often went into the army. In those days, they were chaps. There were very few women in those roles. And then they just believe in serving the state. So when World War One breaks out, you know, the people who could have not gone to war, the upper classes, they were the first, you know, to war. And it was the junior officers, the upper class men, who suffered the highest casualties. So you had this upper class with this very public service ethos. And that was why they didn't need rules. And that's why we have this system where there's virtually no rules on people in public office. That's what I discovered writing the book. So if you're Prime Minister, if Sunak, the day after he loses, wants to go and work for Vladimir Putin, that's perfectly legal.
Yeah.
There is no law stopping that. If he wants to go and lobby for the Kremlin, you know, wants to become a lobbyist in London, that's totally fine. I mean, Akoba, the government watchdog, will say, oh, that's not nice. But you can ignore that legally.
Yeah, that's astonishing, isn't it?
You say it's interesting in that vein, sunlight doesn't bite. So there was a kind of, after, when, this is going back a long way, but when Lord Nolan did the first report on public standards in public life, I think 1995, you know, and then there was the Act in 2000 responding to the Eccleston affair where £1 million had gone Labour's way, and it was all attached to exemptions for the, you know, tobacco industry and all that, advertising rules. That actually the system that was put in place initially wasn't strong enough, and if you like, the immuno system of the British state was not strong enough.
No, I mean, the Nolan Principles are put in place by John Major, who, you know, with hindsight I can see was a good chap, just as Gordon Brown was a good chap. I think Theresa May was a good chap. They believed in public service and they did not enrich themselves in evil ways, I think, after office. And so Major puts this in place, but they're not really any sanctions. It's just saying this is what you should do. And Nolan, I think they thought that we, the media, would be the watchdogs. So, you know, if you went to lobby for Evil Incorporated after you'd been a public servant, then it would be in a newspaper and you'd be shamed out of doing that. But, you know, there's so many horrendous scandals in the British media every single day. Completely true, exposed by brilliant journalists who I lent on for this book, like, you know, Gabriel Pogrund or Peter Gauguin. And the people in the scandal just ignore it. They just soldier on.
Why? How do they get away with that then? Because we, in the media, we like to think that we are a check and a control and a balance. But like you say, these days, I think they price any scandal in and they just march on. And the general public does seem to be totally unafflicted by it. Why is that?
I mean, the general public is bothered by corruption. And every now and then a scandal cuts through, as they say. So Partygate fells Boris Johnson.
Michelle Mone, for instance. That kind of thing.
Very rarely when it's just such a brilliant story that the public realises it. But, for example, Richard Desmond lobbying the then housing minister to be allowed to build stuff in Tower Hamlets against rules. I mean, it's been reported all and over again in the newspapers, but the public doesn't really notice. There's just too much. I think the other thing is the public has it's given up. People now expect political corruption. So you remember 30 years ago in the major era when there were these two nobody MPs asking cash for questions.
Yeah,
Mohammed Al-Fayed had given
deal.
their money to ask questions on behalf of Harrods in the House. It was really irrelevant, didn't make any difference to the functioning of Britain. But it was this total scandal. Everyone was really upset. And now, JCB is a big funder of the Tory party, JCB, the big digger company. So you get Tories standing up in the House saying, oh, JCB is a great company. And it's not even a scandal.
Yeah.
We've just come to expect this level of horror.
Is that a one-way street? Is there any way back from that, do you think? I
think that what doesn't work anymore is the good chaps theory, that they're good chaps and they'll just be good, and you can kind of shame them in the way that Profumo was shamed out of office. There's no shame anymore, and so I think you need rules. And I think when Labour come into government, if Keir Starmer is genuinely going to try to tackle corruption, which I think Labour would be a good winning move for them, then you just have to write rules. So when you've been a cabinet minister, you cannot become a lobbyist. I would say for 5 years. Yeah. If you're a prime minister, I would say you can never become a lobbyist. You can never work for a corporation. That's tough. You've been prime minister. If that is going to deter you from becoming prime minister, great. Then we don't want you as PM. Once you've been prime minister, you can give speeches. In democracies, you can work for media. You can do one or two other things, but otherwise, no. And so I think you just need really strict rules because the good chaps thing doesn't work anymore.
You talk about rather brilliantly about borrowing the idea of dishonourable discharge.
Yeah. So, I mean, now when you leave politics, you get a pension for your time. And, a lot of people get an honour. Cash for honour is this whole other thing, which I tackle in the book. And you come out of it and you're looking good. You're an ex-minister.
Yeah.
So you've had a job. Now, if there was something like a dishonourable discharge, there's a body that says this man or this woman has been involved in a scandal that is so egregious that we are dishonourably discharging them like you would in the past be, or I suppose still from the army, then, go and try and find a
your
good job.
options are narrowed. Yeah.
It does narrow things a bit, yeah.
Yeah. Where did it all start going wrong?
I would say the decline starts unnoticed with Thatcher. Thatcher herself was not corrupt. She believed, as a Christian, she couldn't take money. She was very strict on those kinds of things. But Thatcher is the first PM to have grown up after the wars, and she doesn't really believe in the public service thing. She thinks public service is for softies, real people work in business, and the state is this kind of, shouldn't really be there. So that's very different from the Macmillan Good Chaps view that, the greatest thing is to serve the British state. And at the same time, London gets much richer under Thatcher. You have the city, the Big Bang, suddenly you have loads of money floating around. Then the Russian money, post-Soviet money comes in. People like Roman Abramovich move here because it's, you're not likely to be gunned down in your restaurants in Knightsbridge. And they start spending money. And they realise, it's handy to buy a politician because, as we did in Russia, it keeps things moving smoothly. How much does it cost to buy a politician in Westminster? 70,000 quid. And you're laughing, and they can't believe it. 70,000 quid, but that's what I give to, the concierge.
Yeah.
And, for 70,000 quid, you can meet the Prime Minister.
Yeah.
And so you get this huge flow of money into London, and then you get the impoverishment of the state with austerity. Westminster is now quite a poor zone of London. And a mile away, there are these fabulously rich people who've acquired British citizenship with golden visas, or who are British, like Chris Benobi, the hedge fund manager, and they want to hang out with you.
Yeah. You talk, it's a brilliant pictorialisation of it, really. The role of a particular club, 5 Hertford Street, which will be completely unknown to anyone who's unfamiliar with Mayfair private clubs, which is the vast majority of human beings.
Yes, including me.
Tell us about what 5 Hertford Street is and its role in this story.
Yeah, so 5 Hertford Street, if I have the name right, the proprietor is Robin Burley. And he is James Goldsmith's stepson. James Goldsmith was the first kind of Brexiteer in Britain. Robin Burley ran briefly for his referendum party in 97. So he's a kind of public school Brexiteer and a club owner. So he starts 5 Hertford Street only in 2012.
So just to be crystal clear, it's a private members club in the heart of London.
Heart of Mayfair, near Shepherd Market.
Yeah.
And it becomes the place where especially Brexiteer politicians like Gove, Aaron Banks, Farage, right-wing politicians generally, meet very wealthy people, oligarchs, kind of high status people. I think it's the place where Harry and Meghan met.
They did, yeah.
And so it's just a kind of where high society meets. And so there you are as a politician, you're having a glass of whiskey with a very friendly oligarch, incredibly nice guy, and he invites you to stay on his yacht, and it's all good. And so it's the kind of Liz Truss held a lot of her campaign meetings there when she was running for leader. Yeah, Fizz with Liz. Yeah. And so in that kind of world, it's like meeting your mate in the pub. You go in, loads of people. Nadine Dorries, she wrote the worst book ever, or in my account, one of the 3 worst books I've ever read, and she wrote it in 5 Harford Street because of course. And
this will be the plot, I think.
This is the plot. Yeah, I was going to say there isn't actually a plot either of the book or what she's trying to describe.
This is true.
You're correct on the title. It is the plot. And 5 Harford Street, one habitué called it to me the Heart of Darkness Street, but it's not that it's sort of uniquely evil. It's just in every era in London you have to have a place where the elites can meet, especially the political and the business elites. And once upon a time it would have been the clubs of Pall Mall. It's not that anymore.
Yeah.
And I think, doesn't 5 Harford Street also feature in Caledonian Road by Andrew Hagen?
It does, yes.
As the meeting place of the Russian oligarchs and the bent ministers, So
it does. But it's interesting, this whole idea, I think, that we're now very, very vulnerable to all this. The political system is very vulnerable. You talk about the libertarian buccaneers of Mayfair, i.e. the hedge funders, and as distinct from the old school City of London bankers, and how they are buying influence, as you just said, at really bargain basement prices.
I mean, to understand corruption, you have to understand who's funding. And so you have to look at political donations. And donations to the Conservatives shot up first. To Labour, they've shot up now because everyone who has money and wants power is now going to Labour, obviously. But it began with the Tories, and with the Tories under Cameron are largely funded by kind of traditional city types. Stolid, what's good for the city is good for Britain stuff. And then after the referendum, traditional business peels away from the Tories. Most of business is not really keen on Brexit. And so the Tory funding starts to come from a bunch of what I call libertarian buccaneers. I mean, I highlight Paul Marshall, who, for a long time is the force behind GB News, and Chris Pinodi, the hedge fund manager. There are other people in that vein. They run their own kind of financial shop in London. They don't have any shareholders to report to. They like to keep things kind of lean and mean, and they want no regulation at all. They hate the EU. Some of them have had tangles with the EU over regulation, and no taxes. And so they become the kind of big funders to the post-Brexit Tories, and therefore gain a lot of power within the party. And Paul Marshall, through GB News is a way of giving money to Tory politicians. Because these people you see presenting the so-called news on GB News, I mean, it's well paid. So I think Lee Anderson, when he was doing that, he was getting more from Paul Marshall than he was getting as an MP.
That's right.
Yeah.
He was getting $100,000 or something like that, wasn't he?
He'd warned people previously. If you need $100,000 on top of your salary, you should be thinking about yourself.
And you said that they were giving money post-Brexit, but they were also behind Brexit itself, weren't they?
Yeah. So a lot of these people, they are big funders of the Leave campaigns. Aaron Banks is as well. He's again that kind of individual financial loose cannon. And the Remain campaign is largely funded by American banks, the big funders, like Goldman and JP Morgan, who don't want Britain to leave the EU. And so, you have financial interests on both sides, but on the Leave side, it's these buccaneers.
And just to hammer the point home, the only real reason these people are acting like this is self-interest, isn't it? It's not through there's a masquerade of national altruism, but actually, when you look at the outputs they're after, they're all quite personal, aren't they? As you said, low taxes, deregulation, more money, control of power. Am I oversimplifying it?
You see, I always resist the idea that people who get involved in politics are strictly cynical, because I think that underestimates the level of vanity and self-dramatization and fantasy that goes on. I think if you run your own company, typically you're a public schoolboy, you go to the city, you make it big, and you think, well, the only problems I face were regulation, all these pesky rules, and look how I made a brilliant success of my company. And that's how we should run the UK.
I see.
UK has all these pesky rules. Well, if only the UK were like my hedge fund,
Right.
things would be a lot better around
So,
here.
so then, in mitigation for these ghastly people, then
They do believe this.
They do believe it works. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure with all of them. So, I mean, so Chris Benodi, he funds Brexit, but then he bets on a recession.
That's
as a
right.
result of
Yeah,
That's
Brexit.
right. He made a huge amount of
Yeah,
money
yeah.
on the pound tanking, didn't he? And
Yeah. He'd also bet on an instant recession, which proved incorrect. But so I think
yeah.
OD financially understood that Brexit was not advantageous. So yeah, he may have been a cynic.
Yeah.
You make there's a fascinating part of the book, which is about how after February 2022, when Putin finally invades Ukraine full scale, there's a sort of, the sanctioning means that there's a space to be filled. Now, who fills the space?
Yeah, so what we've done in London, what the government has done after the invasion, is we've excised mostly the Russian oligarchs, who were, I suppose, a very large part of the funding of the Tory party 2008, 2022. And, of course, there are rich people who aren't from Russia. You have rich homegrown people like Paul Marshall. There are rich people from Kazakhstan and especially from the Gulf. So I think what you're going to start to see is more Gulf money. So you see that Lebedev's newspapers, Yevgeny Lebedev's newspapers, there's now a Saudi stake in them. The UAE tried to buy the Telegraph and the Spectator, which the government blocks because Telegraph, he who controls the Telegraph and the Spectator controls the mind of the Tory party.
Yes.
So that was a bit too close to home for them.
Yeah.
So, yeah, you can get rid of a few Russian oligarchs, but that doesn't mean you get rid of the problem.
Yeah.
It's interesting because you talk about the reality that, we're now looking at Labour as the party of government and the challenges it faces, how do you rate its chances? I mean, you're looking at the culture of Starmer's Labour, of being able to clean up the system. It's not the same as the Tory party in its dependence upon these kind of interests, but it does take money from the private sector. So what can we expect from a Starmer government, do you think?
I mean, right now, Labour is rolling in money. They had no money 2 years ago. Until 2 years ago, for most of the last 15 years, the money had all gone to the Tories. Corbyn's Labour had virtually nothing. It was trade union funding, not very much. And so Labour's long-term interest is to reduce money in politics. I mean, our political donations are out of control. Frank Hester, who made these horrible remarks about Diane Abbott wanting to shoot all black women, has given the Conservative Party about £15 million in the last year.
Yeah.
So we have no controls on donations at all. Labour should put them in and be in its long-term interest. But its short-term interest is, we got all this money, why would we want to curb donations? I think I'm more hopeful about Labour, because one is that any party that's been in government for 14 years starts to get lazy and corrupt, and it starts to attract kind of people who are just grifters. Because if you're a grifter in the 2010s, obviously you're not going to join Labour. You think, I'm going to be in with the Tories. That's where the power and money is. Yeah. And now grifters are going to start moving to Labour, but not yet. The other thing is that Tories, because it's a largely public school party at the top, a lot of their friends are multi-millionaires. And they think that the MP's salary, which is somewhere around £70,000, don't have the exact figure in my head, they think it's ridiculously low. So their peer group lives in Notting Hill, and that's what they compare themselves to. So Tory politicians feel poor. Boris Johnson felt poor. Whereas Labour politicians, their peer group, much more from NGOs, academic sector, trade unions, they don't feel particularly poor. So they don't have this kind of desperate need to become mega rich at the moment. And also, Labour never expect power. Labour feel, well, this is a Tory nation, and the tabloids hate us, and if we get in by accident, we have to behave really well. Right. The Tories get a bit complacent in power. So I'm more hopeful of Labour. I think there will be some anti-corruption reforms in the next year or two. I'll be waiting very, very impatiently and critically for them.
The book that made a massive impact was Chums, wasn't it? That really exposed, I think, just the depths of kind of networking that goes on at the top of British society. Just outline just how bad that is for a start. But is there any sign that that's getting any better as time goes on?
Yeah, I mean, this dawned on me the night of the Brexit referendum. So I'm watching TV at dawn in horror. I'm seeing all these characters troop across the screen. And I realise I know all these people because they were at Oxford University, either with me or just before me. They're all
Tell me about it.
Oxford blokes. I was to say, I think you were even more up close. A lot more up close than I
I'm
was.
feeling really inadequate.
No.
I didn't even go to any university.
So this very conversation is an example of the inbred nature of the whole system.
Exactly, yeah.
But I wasn't close to any of these people, whereas you were. I just observed.
Oddly enough, not while I was there, but it was a very, very, very revealing read, and I was very, very glad not to be in the index because I didn't lead a political life, but they did.
They did. So all these people, they arrive at Oxford at 18. Very largely, they often know each other from school, like David Cameron and Boris Johnson.
From Eton, yeah.
Jacob Rees-Mogg. Yeah, Eton or a few other schools. So Dan Hannan, who becomes the brains of Brexit, I think he was at Marlborough. And so if you're at Marlborough and you're at Eton, you have friends in common.
Yeah.
And you also have codes in common, so you meet and you get on. And then you join the Oxford Union if you're a right-wing, politically inclined person. And you build these networks, which are often competitive. So Michael Gove supports Boris Johnson to become Oxford Union president. And then 30 years later, Gove supports Johnson to become PM until he doesn't. And so they're these very kind of close clusters of people who are learning politics from each other on the Tory side. On the Labour side, you have the Oxford Labour Club with Keir Starmer. It's a very small club, about 30 people at any time. But Keir Starmer, Ed Balls, the Miliband brothers, Yvette Cooper, everyone who most people become top of Labour, they meet there. And so it's this incredibly small world. And that matters. It's also very hard for other people to break into. And I try and show in Chums how the Tories, the Oxford public school Tories who made Brexit, how removed their whole lives have been and how their fantasies of Britain's past are so different from most British people's.
Yes. And I wondered whether the way that media has changed as well has come to suit their skill sets more. Social media and broadcast television, the snappiness and brevity of debate and the oppositional nature of everything, the lack of long-form considered argument. That's like the Oxford Union, isn't it? That's what they're training themselves to be like.
So the Oxford Union is about kind of repartee and wit. I mean, it's not a very serious place. And so someone like Johnson, who could play the buffoon, he only had one comedy act, and we know he's done it for us.
Wheels it out time and time again.
Every time it's the same act, but he does it well.
Yeah.
And so someone like that does well at the Oxford Union. It's not really a place for. So the Labour side is much more wonkish and boring, and post-Marxist ideas of the state. And you get some people who at Oxford, political people, use the opportunity to really learn and be serious. And I cite two examples: Dominic Cummings, Ed Balls. Very serious kind of students of politics and history at Oxford. But most people don't. And I think that more than the change in media, what I identify in the book is that the change of era, we lived, I think, until Brexit in an unserious era at the top of society. So for people who've been in the war, and really been right in the war, like Macmillan, like Ted Heath, like Dennis Healey, politics was serious. If things went wrong, there would be Luftwaffe planes flying over London, or the Soviets could nuke us. I mean, Macmillan, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, he lives in absolute terror because, the man limped the rest of his life from World War I. He knew what the end of the world was. He'd seen the end of the world. And then you get my generation, people like Boris Johnson, David Cameron, Jacob Rees-Mogg. To use a phrase from Samuel Beckett, these are not serious people. And you do Brexit, maybe it's not going to work. They realise maybe it's not going to work. But you know what? It'd be fun.
I think what I didn't appreciate when I was there until a long way down the line was how for them Oxford wasn't a university at all, really. It was a sort of antechamber to everything that followed. They were honing their skills with a very conscious plan. And it worked. This was what I found amazing, was that, Johnson, Cameron, others, they all wanted to be Prime Minister, and several of them did. Yeah. Not so Cambridge.
Not for politics. Not
for politics. No, but it really is that it's not a place to go for higher education. It's an incubator.
Well, it can be a place to go for higher education. So Dominic Cummings wanted it to be a place for higher education, and it was.
But it's an incubator for that. But I suppose, to be fair to Labour, if you look at the front bench now, although Starmer was at Oxford, he was there to do BCL, and his first degree had been at Leeds.
Yeah.
Angela Rayner, they're not.
Well, Rachel Reeves is a classic
Reeves
product of the route that I've described.
Yes, but it's a more diverse group, isn't it? I'm trying to be optimistic here. maybe wrongly.
Well, I mean, Labour is sort of by its nature a bit more diverse, although every Labour leader since the war except Gordon Brown did go to Oxford. But they don't do the Oxford Union because Labour boycotted it for long periods as this kind of shallow upper-class institution. And mostly in recent times, Labour leaders, except Blair, have not been to public schools, so they don't come from this very, very small caste which kind of knows each other before birth, in the sense that if you're Cameron and you're Osborne, your interfamilial connections go back generations in this very small British upper class. So Labour is a slightly more diverse group. In the Blair era, there was a lot of people from Scotland who came from this whole completely different political elite where they don't care about Oxford or Cambridge. And so it's a little bit less inbred in that way.
Yes, and yet horrific, isn't it, really, that we're talking about who runs the country in terms of where they are between the ages of 18 and 21.
Well, people talk about a meritocracy. I mean, the irony is that all of these people talk about a meritocracy,
a class of society,
and opportunity, and the equalisation,
social mobility.
But it's absolute bullshit, isn't it?
I think there used to be a meritocracy also in politics. I think there was a rule in both parties that you couldn't nominate. You had to nominate as your leader somebody who was very bright.
Yeah.
And so
That's
Blair, Heath, Thatcher. I mean, so I was very against Thatcher, but I can see that she was a very bright, serious, hardworking person.
Yeah.
I wouldn't have voted for her now, but she was a serious person. Mm. And that changed. So once you have in the biggest role in the country, Boris Johnson and then Liz Truss, you can't really talk about a meritocracy anymore.
That's right.
No.
Listen, let's switch topics slightly, because you wrote a wonderful book about my favourite city. In fact, I think it's possibly the second best memoir about Paris, the impossible city.
Only the second best.
The first being A Movable Feast.
I'll give you that.
In my by Hemingway. But and as I said at the beginning, as a young man, I dreamed of living in Paris. You live in Paris. What's Paris like these days? Because this is the new European. So let's spread our wings a bit. Tell us how life is.
And there is an election.
Yes, indeed.
Paris is braced for the possible entry of the far right into a French government after the July 7th elections for the first time since 1944, the fall of Vichy. Yeah. Paris doesn't vote far right. I think it's about less than 9%. And this is going to be a massive shock. And like with the Brexit movement, the far right movement in France is partly an anti-capital city movement. So Brexit was against London in part. The far right is very much against Paris, and Macron is the embodiment of Paris. So I'd argue that Paris is a very, very successful city right now. 3 of the 5 highest value companies in Europe now are French luxury companies based in Paris. Paris has become a cycling city. It looks better than ever. It's amazing. And
what about the tensions that were always the subplot for Paris around the banlieue, around the side?
Yeah.
I mean, how is? I remember the last time I was in Paris. It's actually pre-COVID now. I'm walking from the station down to the Seine, and was struck by how the mood seemed to be a little bit more hostile than I'd remembered, and it seemed like there was tension in the street. Is that just me picking up the wrong vibe? Is it?
I mean, so in the book I talk a lot about the banlieue, which I discovered once I had kids and they began to play football. So every weekend morning we'd go to football matches in the banlieue, in the suburbs, and that was my kind of introduction to the non-elite world of Paris outside the ring road. And massive changes afoot. They're building 68 new metro stations in the suburbs. Right. So 0 in Paris, 68 in the suburbs. Imagine 68 new tube stations in the suburbs of London.
Yeah.
And so this is quite transformative. They're building enormous amounts of housing, often on top of the tube station. And so for the first time in history, Paris and the suburbs are going to be connected. The suburbs only get in the news when there are riots. And this is very distortive. So they get seen as this, place of terrorists and rioters. But the riots last year, which Welsh media got very excited about, they lasted 3 days. Damp fizz, partly because local parents in the suburbs said, you know what, you're not going to burn down the school.
Yeah.
And so people would go and, take their kid by the ear and drag him off home.
Yeah, right.
So, I went out to I cycled out to this suburb where the police station had been attacked, and there was a dent in the police station. It was quite, on the side of this police station. And I thought, okay, where's the riot? It's Saturday night, it's warm, where's the riot? Just walk around, no riot, no riot. Just a lot of people sitting in the main square having, sausage and wine. And I thought, wow, this is quite nice. So
This is a good riot.
So I'm quite optimistic. The murder rate, I mean, people talk about the danger. Marine Le Pen talks all the time about how France has become this incredibly dangerous country. You can't go outside or you'll be attacked by an immigrant. Murder rate in the Paris region has dropped 75% in 30 years. Yeah. It's amazing.
And there's an analogue, of course, with how some of the Tories have been trying to portray London as like this lawless society and it's just not true at all,
it's partly you have to hate the capital. And, of course, a lot of British people are very resentful of the capital, and understandably so in France as well, because all the wealth is there.
It's a planet unto itself, isn't it?
Brilliant. Well, it's been fascinating. We could talk Simon. For hours. I hope you'll come on again sometime.
Well, congratulations. About my Barcelona book.
Which is another great book.
Big Barcelona fan. So,
but buy the book, folks. Book. It's Good Chaps by Simon Kuper, and it's absolutely brilliant.
Thank you.
We endorse it.
We do. Then